Nine.
69. Thank you. And she has been adding to and refining a talk that her dad gave. How many years ago, Meg?
Oh, probably 20.
Oh, it must be more than that.
No.
I bet you think it was
No,
20 years
yeah.
ago. And I know she's been researching and working on this for a long time. So without further ado, Meg Barkley.
I got it. Thank you. Good afternoon. I would like to ask, if you don't mind, to hold questions until the end, and at that point I'd be glad to entertain questions. I don't know if I'll know the answer, but if I don't, of course, I'll tell you. When I started to research this subject back in January, I thought what I would be discussing today would be the early settlers of Westerly, and who they were, where they came from, and what their daily lives were like. But when I started reading, I soon learned that it was a lot more complicated than that. I didn't expect to talk about the native Indians very much, and I certainly did not expect to talk about the Massachusetts Bay Colony. But oh boy, it's all about both of those subjects. I'm going to talk about 7 things today. The tribes, the early settlements of New England, and in Massachusetts, Connecticut, then Rhode Island, the very first beginnings of Westerly, the incorporation of Westerly and who was here at that time. Then I'm going to talk about the Massachusetts and Connecticut land claims, which is quite a story. Then King Philip's War. And then I will talk about the life of the settlers and what their daily lives were like. I'm showing you this slide about the monarchs of England because look how many of them there were between the beginning settlements and toward the end of the period I'm going to talk to you about today. One of the big problems with this is that it was a very complicated period. As you can see, it involved the period of the Cromwells and the Protectorate in England. So every time someone went to England to get permission from the king, who of course was the absolute ruler of the colonies, to talk about something, every time they went it was a different king with different ideas, which really created big problems for New England. Now let me talk about the tribes. I printed up this little map, if I can get beside you, Tony. And the first tribe is the Wampanoags, and as you can see, they were around Plymouth, which of course was the very first settlement. And they were there when the Pilgrims arrived, and then the Puritans arrived. Then over in Rhode Island, we have the Narragansetts in the northern part, and the Pequots had been over here in Connecticut. And the Niantics were Western Niantics and Eastern Niantics. The Western Niantics originally were from about New London over to the Connecticut River, and the Eastern Niantics were actually here in the Westerly area. And if you looked at today's Westerly Sun, Ninigret, the sachem, the headline story in the Westerly Sun today is that they moved his statue again down in Watch Hill, but he was a very important friend of the settlers of Westerly. What had happened to the Pequots? Westerly was settled in 1661. In 1637, the Puritans came down and destroyed the Pequot tribe in Mystic. They marched through the Westerly area, Captain Mason, and they burned down the fort, which was the headquarters of the Pequot tribe in Mystic, and literally destroyed the tribe. There's a very graphic film about this event at the Pequot Museum over at Foxwood. And if you haven't seen that museum, go. It's a fabulous museum. So those are the tribes we're really going to talk the most about today. Now, in Massachusetts, in the Wampanoag Indians, the sachem at the time that the Pilgrims landed was a man named Massasoit. And he was very good to the Pilgrims. In fact, one of his people, Squanto, taught the Pilgrims very important survival skills. You may be aware that the people that came on the Mayflower, only about half of them were alive 1 year after they landed. They had a very rough time. And the Indians truly helped them. By the way, I know that Indians is no longer a politically correct term, but virtually all of my sources were written in the 19th and early 20th century, and they all use the word Indian, so forgive me, I'm going to use the word Indian. Anyway, Massasoit died the year that Westerly was settled, but in the meantime, in Massachusetts, he had been a very important man. He had 2 sons. His oldest son was named Wamsutta, and his younger son was Metacom. At a time when Plymouth colony was still being respectful of the Wampanoags, the people in Plymouth actually gave these 2 men honorary names of former kings of Macedonia, King Alexander and King Philip. And when Massasoit died, Wamsutta became the sachem, and when he died, after arrest by the Plymouth authorities, which we'll talk about later, then Metacom, King Philip, became the sachem of the Wampanoag tribe. Here in Rhode Island, the Narragansett tribe at its peak had 30,000 people and could field 5,000 warriors. The 3 sachems at the time of settlement were first Canonicus, and I apologize, I've mispronounced these Indian names, but many of these names I've only read, I've never heard them pronounced, so I may be mispronouncing them, I apologize. But Canonicus was a very good friend to Roger Williams when he first came to Providence. And when he died at the age of 81 in 1647, his nephew, Miantinomi, became the sachem of the Narragansett tribe. And when he was killed, then Canonchit became, his son Canonchit became the sachem of the Narragansetts and was killed, as we'll talk about later, at the Great Swamp Fight. Down here in the Westerly area, in the South County area, were the Niantic Indians, and Ninigret was their sachem. He was a great friend to the settlers here. And they were really a sub-tribe of the Narragansett Nation, and Ninigret's ties to the Narragansetts were increased by the fact that his sister was married to one of Canonicus' sons, Canonicus being that first sachem I talked about. And over in Connecticut were the Pequots, who were literally destroyed as a tribe by Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1637 in Mystic. Before the settlers were here, a lot of the coastal Indians were decimated by a disease, maybe smallpox, perhaps smallpox. The traders from New Netherlands were coming up along this coast long before it was settled, and they would literally trade right on the beach. The Indians would give them furs in exchange for metal tools and implements and fabric. They didn't have fabric. Excuse me. Now the early settlers. We all know the Pilgrims came in 1620 and that Massasoit and the Wampanoag Indians were very good to them. But 8 years later came John Endicott and a group of Puritans. And in 1630 came a larger group of Puritans with John Winthrop. Now, these Puritans were religious fanatics. They believed that the church controlled everything, controlled the state, controlled your life. They had unbelievably strict rules, and anyone who didn't agree with A, their religion, and B, their way of doing things, was a heretic and was to be killed or severely punished or banished at the very least. In fact, let me read you a little paragraph from a wonderful book, The Town That Saved the State, Westerly, which has been a wonderful reference for me. There is evidence that from the beginning, the English in Massachusetts determined on liquidating the great Indian leaders and subduing the tribes. Cotton Mather seriously maintained that the natives were the offspring of the father of all evil and obscene witches bred here with intent to harass the saints. Therefore, by biblical authority, they were justified in exterminating the foul brood as soon as practicable and peopling the land with those who were made in their own image and likeness. They were never uncertain of their direction. No free Indians, no heretics was their goal. A great dream never fully realized. Great to-do was made about Indian cruelty. One might suppose it was the voice of civilized humanity speaking, but in comparison with the fiendish tortures inflicted on the continent and in England at that time, Indian savagery was the work of novices. John Endicott, who was the governor of Massachusetts many times, one of the leaders of the Puritans, was truly a sadist. The punishment he meted out, I have read stuff I wouldn't even repeat out loud, the things he did to people. But some of the more minor offenses, for example, a woman was whipped for smiling in church. An older man was whipped for holding a prayer meeting in his home because he couldn't easily get to the official meeting house that John Endicott approved of. The punishments were unbelievable, and anyone who disagreed with them and their way of doing things was a heretic. A few things people had to say about this. "What a God have these English," said a chief who rescued an aged wanderer despoiled and banished from the bay, "who deal so cruelly with one another about their God." Chief Ninigret of the Niantics, when asked to favor the preaching of Christianity among his people, he coolly replied that it would be better to preach it among the English till they brought forth its good fruits. William Penn, the founder of Pennsylvania and of course a Quaker, said, "The Indians have some great men among them. I mean for wisdom, truth, and justice, and a code to which they adhered more faithfully than the white man did to his." And by the way, virtually all the Quakers who wandered into Massachusetts were hung. Nathaniel Hawthorne wrote, I love this one. Nathaniel Hawthorne later wrote, "We should thank God for giving us such ancestors, and thank him no less fervently that each generation removes us further from them in the march of time." If some semblance to something in modern history, contemporary history, strikes you about these people that had to kill everybody that didn't think just like them, that has certainly struck me in doing my research on these Puritans. Now, Connecticut was settled by Puritans from Massachusetts in Hartford and New Haven. Stonington was settled in the 1640s, but not by Puritans from Massachusetts. We know that Thomas Stanton had a trading post on the Pawcatuck River down in Lower Pawcatuck in the late 1640s, and he played an important role in history in this area. I'll mention him again. Now, the first white men that came along through this area were the Dutch traders who came up from New Netherlands, the most famous being Adrian Block, for whom Block Island is named. And Roger Williams was a very good man, a preacher. He was a kind and compassionate man who came from England to Massachusetts and preached in both Plymouth and Salem for a few years. But the Puritans could not abide this man because he preached free thought, freedom of religion, freedom of conscience, so he was a terrible heretic, and they literally banished him with a formal document of banishment. So he and a group of like-minded people went to Seekonk, which of course is still in Massachusetts, but right on Narragansett Bay, and they started to plant some food and build some shelters and so forth there. And a friend came down and warned him that John Endicott was sending someone down. They knew where he was, and they were going to capture him and put him on a ship back to England. So he got in a canoe and went from Seekonk and down around and went up the Providence River and landed in Providence and started the colony of Providence with his friends from that Seekonk settlement. He legally bought the land from Canonicus, the Narragansett sachem, and started a settlement. In 1643, he got a charter from Charles I in England, who gave him the right to settle this area known as Rhode Island. The next colony in Rhode Island was Portsmouth. Anne Hutchison was about to be punished by John Endicott, not for something she said out loud, but for what he said she thought. That is the truth. He was sure she thought this, and therefore she was to be punished. And so she fled with a man named John Clark, whom all my sources say was probably the most intelligent and interesting man in the 17th century in New England. And they came down with a group of like-minded people and settled in Portsmouth on the north end of Aquidneck Island, which they called Rhode Island. And eventually a group split off from Portsmouth and went down to the bottom half of the island and started the settlement of Newport, which of course was a beautiful natural port. Another man came down from Massachusetts who also was said to be a very bright man, but of rather flamboyant personality, and when he didn't approve of something, he let you know it. And he came down and bought some land at Shawomet, and in 1648 he named his settlement Warwick after his sponsor, the Earl of Warwick. And in 1644, Providence, Portsmouth, and Newport united in common independence as the colony of Rhode Island and Providence plantations. That's when the name first was established. In 1663, John Clark, that man I said was probably the most outstanding man here in the 17th century, and Roger Williams actually went to England. By this time, they're dealing with King Charles II. And they got a charter from him which allowed them to establish this colony as rightfully theirs. They had purchased this land legally from the Indians, and this land was theirs by decree of the monarchy. And that charter cemented the union of those four settlements: Providence, Warwick, Portsmouth, and Newport. In that charter was this statement: Rhode Island will be a state where no constraint could ever be put upon the human conscience and no limit to human thought. And with that charter was the first colony in the world to be established on the principle of freedom of conscience and freedom of religion. So that was a very major concept. Now we come to Westerly. A group of people, 80 people in Newport, signed an Articles of Agreement on March 21st in 1661, and they amended it with acts and orders that July to purchase Misquamicut. Misquamicut was the territory that is now all of Westerly, Charlestown, Hopkinton, and Richmond. And for the years that I'm going to talk about, that area is Westerly. It was 1738 before Charlestown became a separate town, and 1757 before Hopkinton did. So Westerly was all of this area of southwest Rhode Island for the whole time we're going to talk about. They bought the land with a deed from an Indian named Sissoa. Sissoa had been a Pequot who survived the 1637 destruction of the Pequots, and he'd come over and was a favorite of Miantinomi, the second sachem I talked about of the Narragansett Indians, and he sold them this land legally. Later, when Massachusetts questioned it, Miantinomi's widow actually signed a document, which I've seen, that said that she had witnessed Miantinomi giving this land to Sissoa, and so he had the legal right to sell it to these settlers from Newport. Now, the people who actually came here from Newport, out of those 60 people, they bought the land in 6 shares valued at £7 each. Isn't that amazing? All of this land, it was 153.4 square miles. That's 42 pounds. Now, who first came here? Well, most of you who have toured the Babcock-Smith house know the story about John and Mary Babcock. The Babcock family had come down from Massachusetts. I had so many other people who couldn't take the Puritans, and settled in Newport. And young John Babcock was apprenticed to a Mr. Lawton. I don't know in what business, but he fell in love with Lawton's daughter, Mary Lawton. But apparently the Lawtons did not approve of John Babcock as a match for their daughter, which is kind of funny when you think of what the Babcock family has become, who are all his descendants. But anyway, they didn't approve. So these kids literally eloped. They got in a canoe and they came across the coast from Newport and came up the Pawcatuck River. At that time, there was an opening where the Misquamicut Club Beach Club is. You didn't have to go all the way around Napatree Point over by Stonington to get up the Pawcatuck River. There actually was an opening which has long since been closed by storms. But they came up the river, they landed at Massachusetts down here where Winnapaug Road goes off of the Watchell Road. And the Niantic Indians, led by Ninigret, greeted them, were very good to them. They lived in a cave kind of up behind where Arthur Smith's house is, and until they could build a home. And John and Mary eventually had 10 children. The first child, James, was the first white baby born here in Westerly. Then those two really didn't have much to do with the charter and the members, although John's father did. But the first three people who actually came here were Tobias Saunders, Robert Burdick, and Joseph Clark Jr. I just put up here these three spellings of Misquamicut because when you read these early documents that people wrote, they just wrote phonetically what they thought they heard the Indians saying. And so the spelling is hilarious in all these 17th century documents. Now first I'll talk a little bit about Tobias Saunders. Tobias was born in the 1620s in Amersham, Buckinghamshire, England. We know he was a soldier in the Life Guard of Foot for King Charles I. And he emigrated after his father's death in 1642. Chances are he was a younger son because in the 17th century, primogeniture was still the rule, and the older son inherited everything. So a lot of these settlers who came here from Europe were younger sons who were looking for land and some way to have a life. So he may well have been. And he probably used his small inheritance from his father to pay for his passage. He originally landed in Plymouth. We know that he lived in Taunton and that he worked at the Saugus Iron Works in Massachusetts Bay Colony. But like so many others, he had it right up to here with the Puritans, and he came down to Newport. And we know that he purchased property in Newport in 1654. That's in the records. He also joined the Newport Seventh-day Baptist Church. And in 1661, when these people had bought the land from Sasoa, he acquired a quarter of a share and came here. His arrest to Boston I'll tell you about later. Now, we know that Tobias, during King Philip's War, which we'll cover later, was the one settler who stayed here in Westerly in order to have a liaison with Ninigret. We know that for many terms he was the deputy to the General Assembly of Rhode Island from Westerly, and he married Mary Clark, who was a niece of the John Clark, who was the great intellectual. And they had 10 children, and I listed all these families which I found, because some of you may be descended from some of these families, but his children were the forebears of all these different old Westerly families, including me. My maiden name is Saunders, and I'm an 8th generation descendant of Tobias. Robert Burdick, who accompanied him, did not come down from Massachusetts. He actually came directly to Newport from England. Must have heard about those Puritans. And he came over and settled in Westerly in 1661. We know that during King Philip's War that he did go back to Newport, which everybody but Tobias Saunders did, and later did return to Westerly. And for 1680, 83, and 85, he was a deputy to the General Court of Rhode Island. Tobias was to the General Assembly, he was to the General Court. We know he married Ruth Hubbard, who was the first white child born at Agawam, and he also was baptized into the Seventh-day Baptist Church in Newport in 1652. Now, some sources say that it was Joseph Clark, and others say it was Joseph Clark Jr. who accompanied those other two men here. I've concluded it was Jr. because the town records of Westerly show that at the time of incorporation in 1669, he was the first town clerk. So I think it was probably he. But he was born in 1642 in Newport. He would have been 19 years old when he came here. But he was the son of Joseph Clark, who was born in Suffolk, England in 1618, and the father died in Westerly eventually, so obviously he had eventually come here too. We know that Joseph Clark Jr. was the first town clerk of Westerly, and he was a deputy to the General Assembly for 6 terms. I think from looking at the dates in the records, it was kind of like Tobias Saunders and Joseph Clark Jr. alternated terms in the General Assembly. If you think about it, it was tough to get there. This was woods. It was pretty tough to go to other towns and settlements in the state. And we know that Joseph Clark married a woman named Bethiah Hubbard in 1664. Now, Westerly was recognized in 1669 and incorporated officially as a town. The 153.4 square miles. And these are the inhabitants who were voters. There were 30 families here, only 24 were voters. I guess the others were indentured or something, and so they weren't allowed to vote. But notice, there are several Babcocks here. Now, this is the John Babcock we talked about who came here eloping with Mary. The others, these James Babcocks are not his son James, obviously. He would have been a little boy at this time. So obviously more of the Babcock family had come here from Newport by 1669. Notice that there's also a Stanton listed here. Kind of an interesting story. In 1665, the Menassees Indians on Block Island had kidnapped a Narragansett princess for ransom. But the Narragansetts didn't have enough wampum to ransom her. So they talked to Thomas Stanton, who was their friend across the river in Lower Pawcatuck. Because he ran a trading post and traded with the Indians, he had a lot of wampum. So Thomas Stanton gave them the wampum to ransom the princess, and in return, the Narragansetts assigned to him a part of that Misquamicut purchase in what is now Charlestown. And Thomas Stanton's sons had farms there. That land started where the Wilcox Tavern is, went basically to where the General Stanton Inn is, and it included all of Quannacontog. And they had farms there. In the 18th century, that became the Stanton Plantation, which was a very important enterprise and traded with Barbados and the islands and so forth. But that's another story for another later date. But that's why there are Stantons here. Now, some of these settlers settled, as did Tobias and Robert. Actually, when they came here, the river was the road, and so they actually settled on the river up in what is now Ashaway, right about where the bend in the river is. And but other people out of this group had settled in the Cross Mills area of what is now Charleston, so forth. So they were spread over quite a bit of the area. Now, the Massachusetts and Connecticut land claims are quite a story. From the beginning, as soon as these people bought this land from Sasoa, Massachusetts said no, it was theirs. They claimed that they had conquered lands that had belonged to the Pequots, and that part of that land was a fictitious town that they just named, totally contrary to the charters that had come from the kings. And they had a place that they called Southertown. And Southertown actually was part of Stonington and part of Westerly. And they claimed that was part of Suffolk County, Massachusetts, because they'd killed off the Pequots in 1637. So the Reverend John Crandall and Tobias Saunders were appointed conservators of His Majesty's peace. But as soon as Tobias and Robert Burdick got here, 2 months after they arrived here, a constable came over from Connecticut, arrested them, and took them to Boston. And they were in jail in Boston for 2 years. Their bail was 40 pounds each, which they certainly did not have. And they claimed another 100 pounds from each man for security. After 2 years in jail, Roger Williams bailed them out. I don't know about the 100 pounds for security. Never saw anything in my writings, in the writings I read about that, but I know that Roger Williams bailed them out and they came back to Westerly. Now, this dispute had a lot to do with the Pawcatuck River. In the very earliest documents, the Pawcatuck River is called the Narragansett River. So Massachusetts, who had a charter from the king that took them as far as Narragansett Bay, claimed that it really meant the Narragansett River, and therefore they owned Rhode Island. Connecticut said that their charter, which said Narragansett River, really meant over to Narragansett Bay, and therefore they owned Rhode Island. Now, when I say they had a dispute, I don't mean this was a dispute in the courts. People were coming over here and burning down other people's houses. People were being arrested. And this went on until 1728. After the King Philip's War, which was in 1675-76, we're going to talk about that, Connecticut had come over and claimed that they owned Westerly. But the agents of the colony in Warwick, the settlement in Warwick, in England petitioned for the restoration of Westerly to Rhode Island, and they were granted that. We know that in 1680, it's in the town records, that constables broke into the house of Joseph Clark and landed him in a Connecticut jail for a while, saying that he was on Connecticut land. During the period of James II, James II claimed that all the different charters that the previous kings had given to these settlers were void, and now he declared New England was one colony of New England, and he sent a governor over here to run the whole thing. And during that time, he officially changed the name of Westerly to Haversham. And for 3 years, Westerly was called Haversham. And then in 1689, they changed it back. Finally, George II, who became king in 1727, settled the land claims once and for all. But this was a constant disruption of the lives of these people in Westerly for over 60 years. Now talk about King Philip's War. King Philip's War was the greatest calamity of the 17th century in this part of the world. King Philip, who was Metacom, the younger son of Massasoit, the Wampanoag sachem, his older brother Wamsutta, King Alexander, was accused by the Massachusetts Bay Colony of trying to throw out and overthrow the colonists, which he really wasn't doing. But during this time, Massachusetts Bay Colony had become more and more disrespectful of the Indians, and was by this time not buying the land, but just taking the land, moving their settlements closer and closer to the headquarters of the Wampanoags, and the Wampanoags became more and more distressed and soon felt that the English were people who were completely dishonest, not to be trusted, and didn't want to have any trust with them. And King Philip said that there was no reason why he should deal with these governors, because these governors were not the leader was the king in England, and that if they wanted him to sign documents about the land or anything else in Massachusetts, that the king should come over and sign with him, because he was the king of his tribe and he wasn't going to deal with these governors. So it just got worse and worse. And eventually the Indians started attacking different little settlements of the colonists around Massachusetts. And the first shot of King Philip's War was actually a young English boy who Indians entered his house, and he picked up his dad's gun and shot an Indian, and that was really the first shot in the war. But what really got the war going was that, of course, Massachusetts Bay Colony considered Roger Williams, Samuel Gorton, and these other people in Rhode Island to be heretics, total heretics, because they didn't believe in the rules of the Puritans and in the exact religion of the Puritans. And they decided that the Narragansett Indians, because they had befriended these heretics in Rhode Island, and indeed Roger Williams, Samuel Gorton were good friends with the Narragansett Indians and treated them with mutual respect. But Massachusetts declared that they too were heretics and therefore were enemies of Massachusetts Bay Colony. And Metacom, so they arrested, as I told you before, Philip, took him to Boston, and then he actually died on the way home. The the Massachusetts Bay Colony claimed that he'd caught some disease in jail, the Indians totally believed that they had poisoned him, and he actually died on the trail on the way home. So the younger brother, Metacom, King Philip, became the sachem of the Wampanoags. And they suspected him of plotting with the French in Canada and the Dutch in New Netherlands, and neither of those things was actually the case. But John Endicott became more and more paranoid about this. So the Indians started to attack the English settlements and burning houses and raiding and burning food supplies and so forth. So at that point, all the settlers in Westerly, except Tobias Saunders, went back to Newport. And during that King Philip's War, virtually all the wooden buildings in Rhode Island were burned to the ground. So then we come to the Great Swamp Fight. Now, the Narragansetts had a large fortification and a big headquarters of the Narragansett tribe on a large island in the Great Swamp over in Kingston. And being on an island in the middle of a swamp was good security. But Massachusetts Bay Colony had decided the Narragansetts were heretics, and their army came down, and on December 19th, the swamp was frozen solid. So they had easy access to this fort. And they found a corner of the fort that wasn't quite finished that they could get into. They went into that fort, and they started burning teepees and killing people, and they eventually just burned the whole fort. And that fight literally destroyed the Narragansett tribe as a tribe forever. And in fact, the remnant of the Narragansett tribe that has lived for centuries in Charlestown were really Niantics, not Narragansetts, because the Niantics survived this. That wasn't their headquarters. But as it said here, there were as many as, the Narragansetts fled, leaving behind 100 dead and 50 wounded. And there were as many as 1,000 casualties among the women and children that day. The English lost 70 dead and 150 wounded. But the war didn't end there. The war went on for another year, and the English couldn't find King Philip, Metacom, who, with his band of warriors, was moving to avoid capture. He actually ended up in the Mohawk country, up on the New York state line. He stayed there for a while, and eventually he came back down to his headquarters, which were really by Mount Hope. And someone betrayed him, and they came down, and he actually was shot by an Indian, not by a British. It was an Indian who had been converted to Christianity by the Puritans and was working for their side, and they killed King Philip, who was considered a great leader by the Wampanoag people. After he was shot, he was beheaded and his body was quartered, which was considered the normal punishment for treason in England in the 17th century. His head was put on a pike, which was displayed in Massachusetts in Plymouth for 25 years after King Philip's War. So when they finally killed Philip at the end of 1676, that was the end of the war. In King Philip's War, 9,000 people died, 6,000 colonists and 3,000 Indians. Proportionately to the population, that was the greatest number of casualties percentage-wise of any war in American history. It was truly a catastrophe. So now these settlers in Westerly, who had built up their places, had to flee back to Newport. In fact, there was no one as a representative from Westerly for 5 years in the Rhode Island Assembly, because they'd all gone back to Newport except for Tobias. And after the war, they did come back, and they had to start over and rebuild their homes. Oh, and they captured many Indians and used them as slaves or sold them as slaves in the islands. And in fact, King Philip's wife and son were captured as slaves and sent down to the islands and never heard of again. These ancestors of ours have a lot to account for. Now I will talk about what life was like in Westerly for these people. Now picture this. In 1661, when these first people came here, Westerly, which was all of Westerly, Charlestown, Hopkinton, and Richmond, 153.4 acres. Along the coast, there were beaches and the salt ponds. On the left was the Pawcatuck River, and the whole rest of the 153 square miles was dense forest and rocky as all get out, as we all know Westerly is. That's what these people came to. And each person, when he claimed his piece of land, had to clear all those trees, get rid of all those stumps, and get all those rocks off the land. I read somewhere recently that they had built these stone walls for aesthetic reasons. Nonsense. These stone walls were where they piled the rocks around the edge of their property to get the rocks out of the land so that they could till the land and grow something and have animals so that they could survive, so they could feed their families. This was what these people went through. And think how alone they were. They were out here, there was no communications. They were a long ways from Newport in terms of transportation and so forth. These people were truly alone. What a life. It is said that many of these men didn't really begin to build a decent house for their families to live in for 4 to 6 years because they had to spend their 16 to 18 hours a day of hard work clearing this land and fishing and trying to grow something so that their families could survive. It is said that the Pawcatuck River was teeming with salmon at that time, and the word Misquamicut does mean red fish. Now, for building houses, they had to send back to the old country to get tools and house parts, and they needed a lot of iron to make nails. I would imagine that some supplies by then were available from Portsmouth and Newport because those were older settlements, but they had to send for most everything from England. They had to do for themselves. Now the Indians taught these people what local foods were edible. They taught them about clams and oysters right off the bat. And they taught them, as we all learned in grammar school, that if you put a fish head under a stalk of corn, it fertilized it very well. And they grew turnips, they grew beans and corn, which the Indians taught them about, and pumpkins were a very base food for them, an important food. For the Indians, corn was a very basic food. And we know that the Indians would grind corn and make little cakes. And often they included wild strawberries in the cakes, or in Massachusetts it was wild cranberries. And they would make these little cakes, and they could put them in a little satchel attached to their waist and carry them as sustenance when they traveled from one settlement to another. And Indians called them journey cakes. And eventually that word evolved into Johnny cakes. But that's where the word came from. Now, they imported cattle, oxen, and swine. Excuse me. Perhaps they could get some from Newport and Portsmouth, but Massachusetts wouldn't sell these heretics anything. No one in Massachusetts was allowed to sell anything to anyone in Rhode Island. They were heretics. It was almost impossible to keep sheep because of wolves. Those 153.4 acres of dense woods were full of bears and wildcats and wolves and foxes. And these people had to deal with those animals on a regular basis. Life was not easy. And it is said that farmers and fishermen worked 18 hours a day. I read one book said that every settler farmed with one hand and fished with the other to survive. Let me read to you what the duties of a housewife were. The housewife's duties were many: milking, gathering eggs and feeding the chickens, all household chores, weaving, spinning, cooking, and having children. They all had about 10 of those. There were many criteria set up for judging a woman in the early days of England, particularly for choosing a wife. Here is an amusing one by English historian Markham in the 1600s. A wife must be chaste of thought, of stout courage, patient, diligent, witty, and pleasant, wise in discourse, but not frequent therein, and not sharp of tongue, I would have had a hard time, and not sharp of tongue, of a cheerful disposition. Such a person will be treated with respect. And the author comments, we would say that she would be truly a paragon of virtue and must have well deserved respect. Another thing that we know from the town records is that they regularly scheduled hunts, particularly for wolves and blackbirds. I suppose the blackbirds were forever at their crops and their seeds. And remember, these people who were doing all these chores didn't have any power tools. They had no bulldozers, no tractors, no chainsaws. They were doing all of this by hand. And in order to counter all these wolves, they would have a scheduled hunt, and every man was expected to participate in these hunts. And a settler, a white man, was paid 10 shillings for a caught or killed wolf, and an Indian was paid 5 shillings. So you see, ladies, unequal pay for equal work is not a new thing. Now, I'd like to end with a couple of small bits of humor. I love this one. Before the Revolution, the poorer class of European immigrants secured passage to this country through indenture, which was not considered a stigma, whereby they were bound to service for a term of years after their arrival. One of these redemptions worked for a farmer in Westerly. After a season of willing service, the laborer intimated that he should like to continue the arrangement permanently. He seemed depressed by the idea that on the expiration of his contract, he would be obliged to toil for himself. Papers for life service were hence made out. On taking the pen to sign the instrument, the redemptioner hesitated, saying that he did not understand how the obligations of the old and new papers harmonized, since they overlapped in time. Explanations were in vain, so the two agreed to destroy the old paper. When the redemptioner raised his pen to sign the new paper, he again hesitated. The employer inquired the reason, since the laborer himself had proposed the life service. The latter replied, "I was thinking of some advice that my father once gave me. He gave me good counsel, and I only wish I had followed it more closely. He once said to me, 'My son, never sign your name to a paper of any kind.' As if I have signed one paper, but have just got rid of it, I think I shall not sign another. So, sir, I kindly bid you goodbye." The redemptioner walked away a free man, much to the chagrin of his erstwhile employer. Now there's Yankee ingenuity. Now I'll end with a little poem that I found, and I loved this. It's just a little verse. It says, "Here's to New Haven and Hartford, the turf where the Puritans trod. In the rest of mankind, little good did they find, but both were quite chummy with God." Thank you. I'd be happy to entertain any questions. I don't know that I know the answer, but if I don't, I'll tell you so. But does anyone have a question? Mm-hmm.
Did you come across anything about the slaves in Westerly?
Yes, but most of that was a little later than the period I'm talking about. But yeah, well, it's another whole topic of the Stanton plantation. But I'm also descended from Thomas Stanton through my great-grandmother, so my dad was interested in this story. But I know that on the Stanton plantation, the records say that they had 40 slaves, black slaves, and as many Indians. But after King Philip's War, they were enslaving Indians, and I'm sure there were some here in Westerly too. They didn't seem to have any objection to the whole concept of slavery for, it was another 200 years before we had emancipation. Yes, in the back.
I'm interested in the role of Uncas. You didn't mention Uncas and his role and the Mohegans, whether the Pequots or even later in King Philip's War.
Well, the Pequots were pretty much wiped out as a tribe in 1637.
But Uncas's role as a Mohegan
Yeah, as a Mohegan, yes, and they were involved in King Philip's War. I didn't cover Uncas only because I was trying to confine it to what influenced Westerly in particular. But yes, he certainly did have a role. There was another question of her, Cheryl.
I wondered what you used for references and where you had to go to find them.
Actually, it turned out to be simple. In fact, I did draw up a formal bibliography, and if anyone is interested in following up in any of these stories, there are a few copies of my bibliography on that table. But these were my primary references. Westerly and Its Witnesses, written by Reverend Dennison in 1878 here in Westerly. But he was a minister, had pretty much the same opinion of the Indians that the Puritans did. But his history is more a history of the churches in Westerly. So that turned out to be of less use to me than I expected it to be, quite honestly. And I fortunately own a copy of that because my dad had it. One of the books that was extremely useful to me is this book, The Town That Saved a State, Westerly. I haven't read the whole book. My husband actually read some of the later chapters, but I was confining my reading to the period I was covering because I had enough to do. But this book is written by a woman named Mary Agnes Best, known as Molly Best. And she was actually involved with one of the important magazines that during the period of Teddy Roosevelt and William Howard Taft played a very important role for them in accomplishing what they wanted to in America. I read Doris Kearns Goodwin's The Bully Pulpit, which one of my boys gave to me for my birthday a couple of years ago, and it was a long weight of 700 pages, but a great book. And she talked in great length about these people. And this Mary Agnes Beth, who wrote this book, worked for that magazine. She wasn't from Westerly, but the amount of detail she has in this book is amazing, and it actually is a history of the town over a very long period of time. I mean, she starts at the beginning and talks all the way up until the early part of the 20th century. Another book that was very convenient for me was the Historical Society of Charlestown wrote this book at the time of the bicentennial. And this book had a lot of good information in it. The chapter about the housewife I read to you was from this book. But this has a lot of very good information. And this book I was lucky enough to find upstairs. It belonged to Ike Smith. And there's another one about the history of Hopkinton, but they started later when Hopkinton branched off from Westerly, not my time period. But both of those books belong to Ike Smith. They have his book plate right in the front of them, and his Ike's book plate. And these I found upstairs in the Babcock Smith House Library. The Town That Saved a State, I also had the good fortune to own my own copy. There is one upstairs too, but this too belonged to my dad, who was very interested in Westerly and Stonington history. Yes?
Did you read anything about the history of the name Westerly, like why Westerly was chosen?
Yeah, actually a couple of people did talk about that, and the conclusion seemed to be its southwesterly location in the state, although there were some other theories about it. Speaking also of resources, I found a lot more information online than I ever expected to. In fact, there's a wonderful 9-page double-spaced article about King Philip's War, which was so informative and very interesting, and I put the link to that on my bibliography if anyone's interested. It's only 9 pages, it's an easy read, but it had a lot of information. And of course, you know, I only had an hour to talk. I didn't talk in great detail about a lot of the other stuff. In the King Philip's War, one of the reasons why that war really got going was because John Endicott, who was really a tough character, he thought that the Narragansetts were heretics because they were friends with Roger Williams and Samuel Gorton, and he arranged to have Sachem Miantinomi, the second one of those Narragansett sachems, he had him murdered. And needless to say, that made the Narragansetts pretty unhappy. Anybody else? Yes, Tom.
Did you come across anything about the origin of the name Rhode Island?
Well, yes, and there are several theories about that, including that it might have been named after the Isle of Rhodes.
Yeah, that was my theory.
Yeah, and that seemed to be the leading theory. But as you know, the state of Rhode Island Providence Plantations, in those early days, Rhode Island was Aquidneck Island, and the whole rest of the state was Providence Plantations. And still is. They still have that incredible name that came from that early time. Yes?
Just one last thing. We're approaching 1669, or 2019 is our 350th anniversary.
That's right.
And the Westerly Town Council will be forming a committee
Ah,
for the anniversary. So we will be looking for volunteers. I'm John Gagne, I'm one of the town councilors. So we'll be looking for volunteers to join in that and help us plan.
uh-huh. Well, the Westerly Historical Society is full of people with all kinds of good knowledge about Westerly.
Oh, absolutely. And the Babcock Smith House also.
Yep.
Here. So yeah, we'll be utilizing all those resources.
Good. Well, we're kind of a joined group now. You know, the Westerly Historical Society and the Babcock Smith Museum are independent organizations, but since we built this wonderful addition to the carriage house, we have given the Westerly Historical Society a home here in the Babcock Smith house. In fact, there is a vault under the kitchen that was our vault, and when we built the new addition, there's an enormous vault under that section over there, under the front door, that is truly amazing with a steel roof and so forth. Our President John Kaduri told us that, you know, in case of disaster, he'd meet us all there. And so we have given the Westerly Historical Society that vault because the library was eager to get kind of rid of both the granite industry and the Westerly Historical Society when they did the renovation a few years ago. So the Historical Society has a home here now, and Ed Fazio, who's standing next to you, who is both a trustee and a docent, is also, until a couple of months ago, the president of the Westerly Historical Society. So we had a tight liaison there during our period when they came in, and now they actually have an address here too. So, yeah, I'm delighted to hear that they are doing something.
The determination was we need to do it years in advance to get ready for the
Great, thank you. Anything else? Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
You didn't stick to your...